Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit publisher dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. A special welcome to Library of America donors and members who support our mission. In 2023, we're continuing Library of America's 40th anniversary celebrations with events like this one. Please check our website, loa.org, for updates. Tonight's program, Honoring Women's History Month, explores the writers who smashed science fiction's gender barrier to create visionary worlds and revolutionary works. The new Library of America special publication, The Future is Female, More Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women, gathers 23 classics from the transformative decade of the 1970s. A companion volume, The Future is Female, 25 Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women, presents earlier writers from the pulp pioneers through the radical innovators of the 1960s. Both are edited and introduced by Lisa Yaszek, who joins us tonight. And our producers will drop links to both books into the chat. Special thanks to our promotional partners for this program, the American Historical Association, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, Dottir Press, and Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. Visionary women writers have been a transformative force in American science fiction from the beginning. But in the 1970s, revolution was in the air, and those liberating energies swept through the genre and the publishing world, changing both forever. By turns fierce, witty, heartbreaking, chilling, and inspiring, the 23 mind-bending stories Lisa Yaszek gathers in this volume make female community, agency, and sexuality central to the imagined future. All place women, as well as characters across a galactic spectrum of gender, center stage, and explore the complexity and passion of the women of the future at every stage of life. What do these fascinating stories have to tell readers now? And how have the intervening 5 decades changed the way we read them? Do their imagined visions and worlds remain inspiring, disturbing, and provocative in our very different cultural moment? Are there paths these writers blazed that remain roads not taken in SF writing? To explore these and other questions, we are very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel tonight. Nebula and Locus Award-winning writer Pamela Sargent's many novels include the acclaimed Venus trilogy and Earthseed, which has been optioned by Paramount Pictures. In the 1970s, she edited the Women of Wonder series, the first collections of science fiction by women. She joins us from Albany, New York. Sheree Renée Thomas is a fiction writer, poet, and editor whose work includes the Marvel novel adaptation Black Panther, Panther's Rage, and the groundbreaking Black speculative fiction anthologies Dark Matter, winners of a World Fantasy Award. In 2020, she was named the 10th editor of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. She joins us from Orlando, Florida, where she's attending the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts. Chelsea Quinn Yarbro is having some technical difficulties. We hope that she will join us shortly. Lisa Yaszek, editor of the volumes, is Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech, and past president of the Science Fiction Research Association. She is the author of Galactic Suburbia, Recovering Women's Science Fiction, and co-editor of Sisters of Tomorrow, the first women of science fiction. She joins us from Atlanta, Georgia. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome our moderator, Lisa Yaszek.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank Max for that wonderful introduction, the Library of America for hosting this event, Pamela and Sheree and Chelsea for joining us, and of course, all of you especially for joining us tonight. In particular, I want to say a special hello to my students from Georgia Tech who are with us. So shout out to the undergraduates from Women in Speculative Fiction and the graduate students who are taking Women in Global Science Fiction. I'm so glad you're going to get a chance tonight to hear from and perhaps even interact with some of the people we've been studying. All right, so I know that people really want to hear from all of you far more than they want to hear from me at this point. So just so everyone knows, I will go ahead and serve as the moderator, and we'll talk for a little bit about science fiction and especially women's science fiction for about half an hour. As questions come up, feel free to add them into the chat. And then towards the end of our hour together, we'll take the last 15 or 20 minutes to answer your questions. All right, great. So without any further ado, let's get going here. So I want to just start by asking each of you how it is, if you can introduce yourselves a little bit past what Max has already told us about you. And in particular, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got interested in science fiction, both as a consumer or a fan, but also as a producer.
Well, I'll start with just talking about how I got interested in it in the first place. It was almost by accident. And I really felt I was the only one who was reading it, as far as anyone I knew, that I knew of nobody else who was actually interested in it particularly. And when I was about, I would say around 12 or 13, I started reading certain science fiction books, not because I knew anything about it or even knew what I was looking for, but just because they were different from anything else. They were just completely different from anything else I had ever read. I mean, I thought I would read a book that with a science fiction idea that might even be a cliche, like telepathy or something. And I would think, this writer must have thought it up all by himself or herself. This is something entirely new. I didn't understand yet that there was this whole body of work. I certainly didn't understand that there was a whole body of work there that women had also contributed to. And I was very haphazard. I picked up science fiction books just because I was curious and just because they looked different. And it wasn't until I was in college that I found out there was this whole community of people who knew all kinds of things that I didn't know, going back to the 1930s and when it started out. And that's how I got started, almost by accident. But I really felt I was almost alone in knowing anything about it up until, fairly late.
Sheree, do you want to jump in next?
How I came to science fiction was through my family. They were science fiction fans. And so grew up in a house of books. There it is. I also enjoyed watching television as well. So it was kind of a multimedia experience, reading books, mostly fantasy. So I would say for the women writers that I became aware of, it was initially through fantasy stories, not necessarily science fiction per se. So I was reading like Susan Cooper, and I was reading like Mary Stewart, The Crystal Cave, and things like that. It wasn't until later that I start reading actual science fiction stories, and that's from the wonderful world of anthologies, right?
Yep.
So, so anthologies were very important to me as a young reader in terms of being introduced to writers that I might not have found easily on my own, and seeing that this is like a tradition, of writers, and seeing, a few possibly female writers. Like I wasn't always sure, but I was reading it, by the names and things like that. I didn't discover Black science fiction writers until I was in college, when I was introduced to Octavia E. Butler's work, Kindred, in a slavery and literature class taught by a Milton scholar. So it was just a very revelatory moment and very life-changing.
Yeah, revelatory. I was very lucky in that the science fiction books I started reading at first, since I got most of them in the library, they were sort of pre-selected in a way. So I was reading Arthur C. Clarke, and I was reading H.G. Wells. And I mean, to me, that was just, it was just different stuff, different science fiction stuff. And that's all I knew about it then. So, but I got interested, and then starting out with Women of Wonder, when I first thought of doing that, it just seemed at the time it was I think the collision of the feminist movement just getting going in the 60s, having that going on, and realizing that science fiction even then seemed to be relegating women in the stories largely to the female character who the male character falls in love with, or she's basically a sidekick, or she's a minor character or whatever. There just were not, there were mostly traditional roles there. And I said, that struck me as odd. And then it also struck me as odd that there wasn't a book with women's stories by women, but that wouldn't have been enough by itself. I didn't want to have, here's a book that shows you that the women who are writing science fiction could write it just as well as the men who are writing it, or writing the same kinds of things. I said, I want to see what they were doing with female characters. So when I was editing those books, I wanted to concentrate on stories, not just that were by women, but that were about women in the story, where the women where the female character or characters were central to the particular story, because that just made more sense to me. And then I spent a long time trying to sell it, which for various reasons, and some of it being that I was young and just starting out and had no experience, so I can understand publishers being worried about that. And also just feeling that the audience wasn't there. Women weren't reading it, so there was really no audience for it. I had a couple of editors tell me that specifically. They said, well, we won't sell enough copies because there aren't enough people who will be interested in it. And it turned out there were a lot of people who were interested in it. And it was just basically, I would say, the confluence of events. Had I grown up in a different time, I wonder if I would have edited the book. If it hadn't been for Vonda McIntyre telling me that Vintage was interested in such a book, and knowing that I had been trying to sell mine for a couple of years, I don't know what would have happened either. And then I had to do a good job, because I said, if I don't, I'll screw it up for everybody. And I didn't want to do that. Quinn.
Oh, I think you might be muted.
Yep.
Well, I'm excited. We have Chelsea Quinn Yarbro here, but we can't hear you. I'm not sure why.
So apologies all around. I'm sorry, but I'm 80 years old and my knees don't work right anymore.
But here you are, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled that we could overcome the difficulties of technology and make it work to connect us rather than further divide us. So thanks so much. And your timing is great. We just to get you a little bit up to speed. So we're going to chat, as you know, for the first half hour or so about women in science fiction, and then we'll open up the conversation to the audience and their questions, which are already filtering in, and we've got some great ones.
I bet.
So,
I bet.
Yes.
I've given the Women of Wonder rap already too. So
yeah. So we're just starting by introducing ourselves and talking a little bit about how you came to science fiction, both as a fan and as a creator.
Well, I came to it because I liked those kinds of stories when I was a little kid. And the first story I ever wrote at the ripe old age of 6 was a fantasy. And it really was a story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end in that order. And that's important, Your readers like it so much better if it makes sense. But I started looking for things that turned on the imagination. And the thing that really got me is I finally stumbled across a story by Theodore Sturgeon. And if you don't know his work, shame on you. He was masterful. He didn't write a lot, because I found out later on that he wanted to do all his writing in one fell swoop, sit down at the typewriter and not get up until he'd finished writing it. And that doesn't make long stories all that easy. But he did a wonderful book called Some of Your Blood, which was about a young man who's rather bewildered and feels a need to drink blood. And I found out later from Betty Ballantyne that it was actually based on a real case. And they more or less tied him to the chair until he finished writing it.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that the nice thing about science fiction, and a little less so about fantasy, is number one, it has to make sense. And number two, you have to believe that it's within the realm of possibility. It can be right on the very edge of that, but Brian Aldiss did a couple of really good stories. He had a magician who had been cursed and he had lost the ability to use prepositions. And writing dialogue for him turned out to be quite a task.
It's also a kind of literature that tells you things do not have to be the way they are, which I think is an important thing for somebody who's young to understand, because you can grow up thinking that, you know, the mores of, say, American suburbia or urban New York City or any number of other places, that's the way of the world, and it's always been that way. And you're sort of stuck in this, and there are all kinds of authority figures who are going to tell you, well, follow my advice. I know better than you because I've been around longer, that kind of thing, which is almost antithetical to science fiction, which is another reason it was sort of puzzling that there wasn't more experimentation going on. Oh, there was, but I mean, that there wasn't as much on the part of the earlier writers, you know, experimenting.
Yeah, well, Catherine Moore did some wonderful stuff.
Yeah, C.L. Moore was great. I mean, but it was always an isolated case. You didn't have this whole group of people basically saying, here, this is one of the things that's just as important as the future technology or the future engineering or the future hard science discoveries.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes, well, years ago, about 35 years ago, I got an interesting letter from one of those male fans who writes some science fiction, and it was tolerable stuff, but you knew that it was, you know, essentially overgrown boys.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd always been well-mannered, but, you know, as a Southerner, you expect that. And he, I got a letter from him saying, you probably don't know, but some of us make jokes about you. And when I wrote back, I began, I'm not deaf, dumb, and blind.
Oh, jeez.
And, but he said, I finally read something of yours, and it was pretty damn good.
Oh, well, wasn't that nice of him to recognize that fact?
And he apologized.
Yeah. Well,
and he's the only one who's ever done it.
Well, at least he apologized. That was the other thing, is that after Women of Wonder and after its succeeding volumes, then okay, now you move from, okay, people can't say, well, women can't write science fiction. Now it was, well, it's not real science fiction. So we had to go through that phase. So there was always, I thought in my naivete, you know, being, you know, so as young as I was when I did the first Women of Wonder, well, this is going to prove the case. I mean, you know, then nobody's going to argue about it, because I hadn't lived long enough to know that, no, you've got to fight it over and over. Then it becomes, well, they're not really writing it. Then everybody forgets it ever happens. Then you've got to start the whole thing over again, like in the 1990s. And even up into the 2000s, it was still every once in a while, and I expect it will probably happen, you know, long after I'm gone, somebody will come up with, look, there are all these women writing science fiction. Isn't that interesting? Although
Yes.
I'm not sure that that might not happen because science fiction is seeped into the culture so much at this point that you really can't write a novel about contemporary life without
Right.
writing science fiction in some sense.
Well, I know that was true of my uncle Tip.
Yep.
Yeah, Uncle Tip wrote an awful lot of feminist science fiction before took off the mask.
So, in my own work doing sort of anthologies following in Pam's footsteps, I found the same thing, that we have to keep recollecting and reminding people of these stories. And like young feminists today are so excited about them, but they don't necessarily know them until they get introduced to them through anthologies or through classes, etc. So, it's an ongoing process. And we'll hope if we keep bringing these things out, people will eventually hear it. Sheree, I wonder, do you have the same experience, especially when you were doing the Dark Matters anthologies?
Oh, those Dark Matter books, they were eye openers for me, certainly. I loved those books. They have a place on my shelves.
Amazing. Me too.
Things that so I'm editing it in 1998, and 99 is when I turned it in, and it was published in 2000. And so I was in a different space there. So it wasn't a question of do women write science fiction, it was do Black people write science fiction, and do Black people read science fiction? And so that was the larger question. People were familiar with Black women writers. We have our wonderful Toni Morrisons and our Alice Walkers and all of these amazing writers, Joel Parker Rhodes, who I just got a chance to talk with recently, and all these great writers, Gloria Naylor. But so when I got the call for submissions, I received a lot of stories from women, Black women. So it wasn't a question about who are we in this space, because they were very eager to be in the space and had been writing. But the question, I guess, was a little bit larger, and what are the kinds we're writing about,
I really very much admire Olivia, why am I doing this? Estelle Butler's work, Octavia Estelle Butler. When you do a series of novels about a character named Olivia, it's very hard to get anywhere near it without having it pop up.
The O.
Yeah.
Well, also there's that thing that can happen, and I'm sure you've all had it happen. You're going along and you've got this character you think is a minor character because you need someone, to bring the news or whatever. And then you think, well, that's the last of them. And they say, oh, no, we're very major. You have to pay attention to us. And it sort of throws the pacing of the story off, which means going back and restructuring a bit. But I think that it's a good exercise because it reminds you that nobody is actually uniformly one sort of person, ever. They go through a lot of changes and they express themselves differently in different company and situations. I think I was very lucky when I was a kid. I had a Finnish father and an Italian mother. That's sort of like having the UN in the living room. And two entirely different views of the world, two entirely different ethnic groups, and two entirely different thoughts on how you raise children. And it was really terrific. My maternal grandmother was very annoyed at me for being born female, so we never quite saw eye to eye. But my Finnish grandfather used to take me aside and tell me Finnish folklore, for which I was very grateful. Because not many people can steal Finnish folklore.
Yeah.
And I do it rather blatantly from time to time. But I really think, you know, if you're going to be a writer, you've got to be willing to gobble up everything from your own experiences and add it to the ones that you've observed, because otherwise your character is going to be wood. And there's nothing wrong with wood, but they don't make very good stories.
So I'm wondering, Pam and Quinn, if you could talk a little bit, I mean, this is so cool to hear about the influences that you're pulling on and how that got you thinking about writing science fiction, and especially from unique and then women's points of views, like not, you know, viewpoints that aren't always represented in science fiction. I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about how do you see that? Did that connect at all with the stories that we included in the Library of American volume with
Oh yeah,
either Frog Pond or
Well,
okay, go ahead.
there are a couple of things interesting about having things in an anthology, is seeing what people actually got right. And what I find interesting now is looking at certain writers. I say they actually got it right when a lot of us miss certain things. And then also what's interesting is where you got it wrong, because that says a lot by itself too. How and why you got it wrong. Not just technologically, but in terms of social roles. I would say that somebody like Chip Delaney, Samuel R. Delaney, was way ahead of his time. I mean,
I agree.
Not just being a Black writer, but also being a writer who dealt with the roles of men and women, or even what we would think of now as non-binary characters, in a way that nobody else was doing. Or Philip K. Dick, another writer who seems now, I mean, well, now he's not just a known writer, he's like a dominant cultural influence in movies and in the culture in general. And he was ahead of his time. And that's of interest. And the thing with stories is there are a lot of stories that are really very inventive that get lost. The novel isn't necessarily the best thing about science fiction. I mean, there are some wonderful classic novels, but there are some wonderful classic stories, and the wonderful classic stories will get lost otherwise if they aren't collected. And they can, and they are very often stories that get lost because they were ahead of their time.
Well, also because they were dealing with issues people didn't want to look at.
Yeah, exactly. Like writing a story about gay characters back in the 1960s in a science fiction story, that would have been a hard sell.
Yes, as you said that, I was trying to think of what someone like Fred Pohl would do with it.
Yep. And that, that is another way in which somebody like Theodore Sturgeon was ahead of his time also, because he was approaching things that might have made a lot of people uncomfortable in those times.
And he was really good at giving you one of those simple, deceptively simple narrative sentences.
Yep.
And you would read it, and you know it would slide in like soft butter.
Yeah,
and then only later on did you realize you were being set up.
Yep. The Saucer of Loneliness, I think that is a story that it does it, where basically you have two aliens land on Earth and they become celebrated because they're so beautiful and wonderful. And then basically what happens is that the population of Earth finds out that these are actually two exiles from their own planet who are basically gay.
Yep.
Right.
And that hits like, now somebody reading that now would have a very different reaction from somebody reading it in the 1960s.
But one of the things I did for a while was I read early 20th century science fiction.
Yeah.
And there's some god-awful writing in it. But every now and then you run across something where they were really tackling something that's important and looking at it as squarely as they possibly could.
So what about like with the themes that you were exploring in stories in the 70s and like stories that we've collected in the future as female, where do you feel like you guys got it right, like channeled the energies of the moment, and those are energies that still really resonate today? And how have things maybe departed from the futures you've imagined? I mean, fortunately, we don't live in a post-apocalyptic landscape like Frog Pond. I'm happy about that.
Yes.
But I'm bummed we don't have time travel for dating, because that's cool.
Well, time travel gets really tricky because, you know, you don't really know what's going to happen next, and you leave out all the little things that we take for granted because we take them for granted.
No.
You know, you have things where there are apparently it's okay to eat anything, and then, but it turns out of course it isn't, for various and sundry reasons. And they'll say that, you know, the world is so crowded that you do X, Y, and Z. Well, no, you don't, because you need someplace to grow your food.
Well,
Picky, picky, picky.
well, when I was working on my Venus novels, there was one thing I wanted to do. I wanted to have, I chose Venus because, well, there were enough people doing Mars. So I said, well, if I'm going to terraform something, I'll terraform Venus. And then if I'm going to deal with the planet Venus, I'm going to deal with female characters. And I begin the book basically with a society of women who basically are controlling. They're a rural community. They run these big farms. They're out in the middle of nowhere in the United States, which is no longer the United States. It has fallen apart. That book gives me the willies now, because I was writing about a world that was falling apart, a world that was that basically had to deal with climate change and a lot of disasters, lack of resources, and then also trying to undertake this extremely ambitious project. And it sort of gives me the willies. It really does. I also, this was the first book came out in 1986, and I had mentioned that the Soviet Union I didn't even mention the Soviet Union. I just assumed it had fallen apart like the United States had fallen apart. So I'm a little creeped out by that. I feel as though I got a little too close to certain things, you know, not as close as Philip K. Dick did or Chip Delaney, but I mean, I think I must have sensed that something was coming. But the roles of women I wanted to be quite different, and I wanted them to be dominant. And basically, so I have these women who are settled in their towns, and the men are just wanderers. They are itinerant wanderers. They wander in, they become the fathers of children, but they don't stick around. They just go off. They basically have their own lives, and the women have their own lives. And I thought, well, you know, whenever anybody would be talking about single parent households, you know, which are usually headed by women in this particular culture anyway,
Mm-hmm.
I said, there is a way that they could work. I mean, everybody assumes they couldn't, but they could. I mean, given a certain set of circumstances. So that's another way to deal with some of these things. And science fiction allows you to do that kind of thing. Say, okay, people assume this is bad. Well, what if you had these particular circumstances? And one of the things that irritates me about people who seem to want to go backwards now, you know, including about, just basically retrogressive politics.
Yep.
Is that they basically want to shut off that kind of possibility. In other words, if something isn't working, well, what would make it work? Instead of just assuming that the best thing you can do is go back to the old and tried and true ways, which, as my grandmother told me long ago, didn't work either. She said marriages were just as miserable then. It's just that most people couldn't get out of them in a way that maybe more of them can now. So
Right.
you know.
Yes. Well, every now and then grandparents know things.
Yes, they do.
So I wonder then if, I mean, this takes us to another topic we chatted about a little bit before this event, right? Which is why do we need to reprint old stories, especially, you know, the first wave of feminist science fiction stories from the 1970s that Pam and Quinn participated in helping create, and that I think Sheree and I both grew up as the benefactors of to a certain extent. I mean, I'm lucky. I grew up reading all of you and Joanna Russ and Sam Delaney, and I was in my 20s before I realized I had a complete misconception of science fiction, and that was really cool, right? I mean, that was pretty.
And
neat.
we need more anthologies like that now. They might not be about women. They might be something else. Maybe there should be an LGBTQ anthology. You know, I mean,
absolutely right.
Who knows? I mean,
yeah. But the old stories, why bring them back? Because I find like my students love when they're reading your guys' work and they're so excited about it. So I don't know, what do you say that you all find like compelling about looking back through the history, especially of women's science fiction? Like, why do we need those stories, especially from the 70s now, if the time is so different, as Max suggested earlier? And Pam, you're saying maybe it's not that different, right?
Well, I think the main thing is this, is that most of the women who are writing it really early on, I mean, that as I was when I first started reading it, felt isolated to some degree. And even
Oh,
the
yeah.
ones that knew, and even the ones that knew that they were part of a science fictional community, say like a C.L. Moore or a Lee Brackett,
Yep.
they were considered the exceptions to the rule. In other words, it was like, you know, you've got the guys, and then yes, you've got these women, but they were the exception. See, there wasn't this idea that, well, this was an equal opportunity activity of writing, and you know, everybody was welcome. You know, it was basically a largely white male bailiwick, and anybody who came wandering in, whether it was a woman or whether it was somebody like Chip Delaney, was the exception to the rule.
Or
And when
someone
you're
like
the
like
exception
Larry
to
Yep.
the rule, that doesn't exactly encourage a whole lot of other people
Yeah.
to think that there's something in it for them. It's only when you have a large enough group of people and you can sort of identify them as, well, as part of a kind of group. Not that they're all the same, but just that they're part of a group, and that maybe you could be one of these people too. That's encouraging, which is another reason to have the anthologies out there, to show that basically to encourage people
Mm-hmm.
to feel that they could be part of the same thing. Joanna Russ once
Yep.
said to me that she called it the honorary man syndrome. In other words, like, you know, if you eventually you could be acceptable and be an honorary man, you know, and that was more, you know, as long as you weren't too female, you know, you could be an honorary man, and that was actually much more admirable, but that was the exception. And and it's important to say, no, that's not the exception. We could actually all be exceptional in our own way, and also part of this group.
Sheree, I know that you came to speculative fiction primarily through fantasy, but you know, surely you've encountered science fiction and been a fan of it since then. And I'm wondering, like, how does that resonate? Do those stories resonate for you at all right now as a younger author?
I'm happy to talk. I really can't speak to, you know, science fiction in the 70s. I was born in 72, so I'm not going to be able
You have a good excuse then.
that was happening about what feminist science fiction writers were doing in the 70s. But I can talk about what we're doing today. I can talk about the kinds of things that we are interested in today. And there are LGBTQ plus anthologies out there that are, lots of people are doing this work, right? So for me, science fiction always has had kind of a reputation amongst itself of being far more open-minded and ahead of our times than it actually sometimes is. I remember reading the work as a young person and not seeing any representation in it, in terms of Black characters that felt authentic to the culture, who actually moved in ways and made choices that would ring with any kind of truth for people who lived in Black communities, who had Black families or what have you, or even had a sense of the future. The fact that visual artists like Alicia Wormsley have to build a billboard that says there are Black people in the future, and that be viral speaks a little bit to that. And for families that are somewhat matriarchal in the sense that the mothers, the women, the grandmothers, that intergenerational relationship between families are power the community. There's a saying in the South, if you have 12 women, then you have a church, whatever your perception of church is, because those are the people who are going to roll up their sleeves and get the work done. Then that our approach to storytelling, the way that we see ourselves in these stories, might be a little bit different, right? So I was thinking back over the table of contents for Dark Matter, and it's not like I sat there and say, I'm going to have all these women writers, but it was just like they were chomping at the bit to tell their stories. Writers like Nisi Shaw and Linda Addison, Tanana Ridu, who's already, doing amazing things in horror. One of my anchor stories by Honoree Jeffers. she is now, an amazing, globally known novelist. Her first fiction story was published in Dark Matter. I went on to do the 2 anthologies. I've just co-edited Africa Risen with Ogini Chowe, Donald Ekpeke, who is the first African, writer living in the continent, not in the diaspora, who's publishing science fiction, with Zelda Knight, who is the person who conceived the original Dominion anthology and had the idea to put African writers in conversation with other Black writers in the continent. So the role, if we're looking at feminism and womanism, one of the things I was thinking about when I looked at these wonderful volumes, I don't know if the audience have their hands on these 2 books, was where are the other writers? Where are the other Black writers? I know the only one I would know of personally would be Octavia Butler, and I don't know what the dynamics were, Lisa, for getting permission to reprint those stories. I'm sure they're a hot commodity now with them being developed into films and graphic novels and things like that.
Yes.
And Octavia was particularly very helpful to me, very supportive to me when I was editing Dark Matter before it even had a title, before I even thought of the title yet. She said that she would support the book, and that she and Martin Greenberg had tried to edit a volume similar to Dark Matter, but publishers, weren't interested because they felt like readers would not want to read a book about race. But the relationship of women, particularly Black women, in these stories in science fiction and fantasy may be slightly different, because even our relationship in society was different. We didn't always have the luxury to have, even if it's a bondage thing, of the idea of what women should be and the roles of women in society. We always had to be right in the fields working with our husbands and brothers and sons. We weren't often protected in society, weren't put on a pedestal. When women chose to be home makers and work at home, there are some places in the South where they were angry because women would not take on the job of being domestics in other women's homes. And so they changed the laws and made it illegal. So there's that famous scene in Alice Walker's Color Purple where Sophia doesn't want to be a domestic, and she actually gets forced to be one. And her punishment after she is, eventually put in jail, is that she has to go and work in the home of the very person that got her taken away from her own children. So there's a lot of dynamics that, that Black women writers are exploring in a lot of different ways, whether it's science fiction and looking at alternate futures or alternate ways of being, whether it's Earth-based or off Earth, right? That kind of takes some of these social themes in play, Are we as far away from this ideal of what womanhood can be in society as what was being imagined in the 70s? I mean, I feel like we are, as Pamela said, we are kind of retreading that ground, because we're constantly navigating that as a society and contesting those boundaries, right?
Yeah, well, in a world where we're literally relitigating things that seem to have been settled, right, in courts in the 1970s, for sure. It's definitely that moment. So we're getting towards the final portion of this. And so I think that this is a wonderful way to slide into some of the questions from our people. And just really quickly, Sheree, yes, it was very difficult to find. There were plenty of women of color writing science fiction in the 20th century, we're finding, but that they were primarily writing in the Black newspapers. So yeah, you're not seeing it in mainstream science fiction. True of Black male authors too, really, until the 1970s. And even then, one of the things I really found in The Future is Female is we see a lot of authors attempting to imagine much more diverse futures in full color, but we're still talking primarily white, middle class, cisgender authors in the 1970s. But beginning to try to open up the dialogue and imagine different futures, right? Which is, I think, a first step towards that. Okay, so anyways, we should stop talking, or at least about art stuff, and let's take some of these questions here. I'm just gonna start. I've got a wonderful list of questions for us here. And so why don't we just jump in? We've got a question from Lori Van Putten of Plover, Wisconsin, who asks, are there still barriers to women writers in science fiction?
Sure.
Yep. Yes, every now and then I hear about somebody who, yep, it's like, well, this doesn't, it's basically the issue of her gender does come up, and I'm sure it comes up a lot with other people too. I mean, not just women. I'm sure it comes up with other people too. Yeah, there every now and then you will run into somebody who's I'll be nice about it and say old fashioned.
Yeah, we've all run into the reader who tells us the way that we should have written the story that they have read.
Yeah.
Sheree, is this something that you've encountered at all as one of the younger writers here? As the youngest writer here, a fiction writer, certainly.
Haven't encountered what?
Have you encountered that kind of resistance to your work as a woman? Like, have you ever received any kind of pushback like that?
I don't know if it's not so much about it being a woman, but it's about being African American, or even having if I have any Black vernacular in the stories, sometimes there's resistance to that, which is quite different. I think it's interesting because I feel like if I said the characters were Jamaican, or if I said the characters were from a Caribbean place or something, then there wouldn't be as much pushback, perhaps. That's something they recognize. There's not the assumption that if you have this accent that you are somehow ignorant, or if you have this accent that you don't know how to code switch, right? So there might be some resistance in that regard, but not necessarily because I was female,
Interesting. Okay. Well, good. I guess this is some progress. But it is interesting how these problems reiterate themselves, right, in different areas of identity as new groups
you think the battle's over, but
more
it really
dominant.
never is.
Yeah, the one thing I find resistance in is in the editing, though. In editing, so I have received like strange random letters. I had to at one point put in our call for submissions, or just to mention that if you send me rape stories and it's not, and it's treated like a plot device, it's not treated like an actual thing that happened to a real person, it's an automatic rejection. Like, I'm not spending any energy on that. So it's like I could tell very quickly when I started editing the magazine of fantasy and science fiction that some of the submitters, some of the writers were not accustomed to having their work read by a woman, even though, of course, edited. You could just tell, like, you think, would you send that story, that same story to a woman editor and think that the objectification of women in the story is going to fly well, or just certain kinds of things, like that you can just tell they're not accustomed to that, having it read in that way. So that's been interesting. Some pushback in that regard. Initially, I think they've all gotten the message.
Good.
Yeah.
So we have maybe this is a related question. Oh, go ahead.
Totally off topic. My bedroom windows open onto a grassy field, and I was aware that there was something going on out there, and there's a doe with two very young deer wandering out there, eating all the grass. Thank goodness.
Also, it seems appropriate, since it's probably going to be a mama deer and babies then in a panel with women talking about science fiction. I'm glad you're observing nature and sharing it with us through technology. That's super cool. Let's move on to a little bit of a different question then, from Venus Enrique of Charlotte, North Carolina, who asks, do you writers think of yourselves as feminist writers?
Yes.
Yes, but not in the sense of like trying to beat somebody over the head with it.
No,
I mean, that's just it's who I am. It's going to come out in the work, but it's not something that I feel that I consciously say, well, I am going to write this as a feminist, and that's what I'm thinking of. There's too much unconsciousness involved in a lot of writing. There's too much that's actually irrational about it. That it's not something I think about when I'm writing, but who you are is going to come out in your writing one way or another. And that, which is why Sheree gets some of the submissions she gets, is some of the stuff is coming out.
And there are people who write for what they think is their audience, and you can't do that. You have to write what you have to write.
Exactly. I don't know who my audience is. I mean, Fred Paul once said that your audience is some guy in Cleveland or somebody in Cleveland at 3 a.m. That's your audience, which is as good a way to, that's one way to think of it. You don't know. You can't write for that. You have to hope that the audience will find it somehow. You know?
That's why I miss the magazines.
Yeah, I wanted to answer that. I do see myself as a feminist writer. Depending on the story, sometimes it's a conscious thing. I have a question, I see something that's happening in the world and I have a question about it. But the term that I use more frequently, because I think sometimes white feminism can be quite problematic, I see myself more as a womanist, right? And in a sense, in the sense that I'm looking at not just gender, but I'm looking at class as well, right? And I'm looking, you know, we used to say parenting magazines sometimes aren't very useful to all mothers, right? Because they only talk to their contacts on the East Coast or their contacts on the West Coast, and that's it. The rest of the country is left behind in terms of their quotes in the way that they're thinking about parenting and parenting children over ages, you know, over the ages. And I think that sometimes a part, you know, kind of the problems in talking about feminism, right? That it's there's an overlap, there's a Venn diagram of when feminism gets overlapped by other loyalties, right? And so
such as corporate feminism as opposed to womanism.
Yeah, what'd you say?
Corporate feminism is what you don't want.
Right.
Yeah.
Performative, like we're gonna go and we're gonna knit all these pink hats and wear the giant, you know, safety pins to show that we're allies. But when I actually need you to be an ally in the PTA meeting, or you know, or when my child, you know, like more than 3 of my children show up at your school, you know, then that feminism kind of backs back a bit, right? So, you know, it's in the action. So I see myself more as a womanist, because I feel like not only are women and girls capable of doing all of the things that you know, all of our you know, pioneers work so hard to normalize and make that something that people imagine in their fiction as well in the real world, but also that it can go across these class lines as well. If it's not a feminism that is practical and works for working class women, then what is the feminism really? You know what I mean?
Yep.
I love thinking and talking through the diversity of feminisms. And it's something that I saw even as I was putting together the Futures Female volumes, that even that early on, right, it's a conversation between women about what feminism is going to be and how it does intersect with these other points of oppression within the systems of global capitalism, I guess, right? And so it's no surprise to me that we're continuing to talk about that today. So I think we have time for one more question. And I think this would be a nice one to end with. This is from John Osselin in Sandia Park, New Mexico. And he asks, what would each of the panelists like to see more of in science fiction written by women? What kinds of science fiction do you want to see women writing, the next generation?
Well, they're anything they want to write, because there are so many of them writing now, and there's so many good writers in the field at the moment, and so much new stuff coming out that's always of interest.
And don't chase the market.
They can write whatever the hell they want, because I mean, it's going to be worth reading, probably. You know, the stuff that's coming out from some of the best writers. I mean, it's amazing how much good stuff is coming out, and I get annoyed sometimes with old folks like myself who seem, oh well, that's not what it used to be, and well, I don't know where this stuff is coming from, or I don't understand it and everything. Well, you know, you're missing something if you don't. So I have no recommendations. I just want the good ones to keep writing what they're writing.
I like to quote Sapphire, the poet. She said to write through the times where you're marketable and write through the times where you're not, right? You know, the world will catch up with you, right?
Yep.
And so I just think that women writers around the world are writing the things that are passionate for them, the things that they really care about. We're seeing an explosion of this in YA literature in particular. There are a lot of debut authors who are really pushing the boundaries about who gets to be the subject of a science fiction story, who gets to be their heroes, and how they move and direct their own lives, the kind of self-determination and agency they have. And, you know, if we thought about it, almost every topic you can think of, there's some, you know, woman writer who has really tackled it in a unique, interesting way. I feel like we're in a very fortunate time. There is this kind of excitement. I don't know if people are asking themselves if they have permission as much as they used to.
Yeah.
Do I have permission to write about this?
Exactly.
And
also, if you're a young person now reading new stuff, you don't have to do as I used to have to. You almost have to, in the old days, you almost had to enjoy certain stories. You almost had to be like transgender. In other words, well, I'm not the boy, but, you know, I can imagine being the boy, you know, since he's having all the adventures. Well, you don't have to do that. You don't have to have that kind of transgender reading experience anymore now, unless you would like to. So that's good. That's an improvement. That's an improvement.
Published now.
Boys,
so that's exciting,
boys
right?
And
published. Yeah.
And boys read these stories, right? Like boys like Rey just as much as girls ever liked Luke Skywalker, right?
Yep.
So maybe that's one of the most important things I think that feminist authors like all three of you have done is is to open up those futures, right? To make the future female, not just for other women, so we can connect through time and space, but also for all people across class, as Sheree is saying, and across gender.
Yeah.
Well, as someone who writes historical horror, among other things, I've got to a point where I get aggravated with people who are only interested in what Senator Man is up to, because those books are all about the lives of women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're where his focus is, and as a reader, you should give a damn.
Well, thank you. I think this is a great place to end the conversation. And I just wanted to thank you all for, you know, a really interesting and probing and passionate conversation. And I don't know if you've been keeping your eye on the Q&A, the questions coming in, but there are so many questions coming in that we could spend another hour just answering the questions. So thank you so much for that. You've been listening to Chelsea Quinn Yarbro, Lisa Yaszek, Pamela Sargent, and Sheree Renée Thomas discuss The Future is Female, More Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women, the 1970s, edited by Professor Yaszek. A companion volume gathers stories from the 1920s through the 1960s. Please join us for more online events from Library of America. On April 20th, acclaimed writers Tobias Wolff and Nicole Krauss join LOA Live for a masterclass on one of Bernard Malamud's greatest stories with Malamud biographer Philip Davis. So watch this space. We'll announce which story they're going to be discussing next week. On May 17th, Roy Blunt Jr., Raj Chast, Ian Fraser, Mary Roach, Paul Theroux, Calvin Trillin, and other special guests join us for a tribute to Charles Portis, author of True Grit, whose novels and stories have been called one of the great pure pleasures in American literature. Details about these and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about The Future is Female, Bernard Malamud, and Charles Portis volumes, and links to purchase those and other editions of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to Chelsea Quinn Yarbro, Lisa Yaszek, Sheree Renée Thomas, and Pamela Sargent. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and have a great evening.